Emmett Vance had lived alone in the narrow house behind his apothecary shop for 11 years, and in all that time he had never once locked the back gate. It opened onto a strip of land between his property and the tree line, a no-man's quarter-acre that he kept loosely as a kitchen garden, though in truth the kitchen garden had been his wife's idea, and since Clara passed, he had let most of it go to grass. He kept the rosemary hedge, the feverfew, and a struggling row of comfrey along the fence. Everything else had seeded itself into wildness. Goldenrod in September, wild mint at the creek edge, a tangle of self-seeded yarrow at the back corner that he'd always meant to cut back and never quite got to. He was not a man who wasted things, and so leaving the garden half-wild was a compromise. It bothered him only mildly, the way small failures of upkeep do when a person is occupied and mostly at peace with himself. He was closing the shutters on an October evening when he saw her. She was tall, taller than any person he had seen up close, and he had lived in Sallow Creek his whole life, which meant he had seen a great many frontier types pass through. She stood at the far end of the garden where the comfrey met the weeds, and she was cutting with a small knife, her movements very deliberate, as though she had done this particular work 10,000 times. The dying light caught her gray-green skin, and the dark braids looped back from her face, and the thick linen of her apron moved against the breeze. She had a carrying basket on one arm, already half full, and she handled each cut stem with the particular care that meant she understood what she was harvesting, not stripping the plant, leaving the crown, taking from the outside. Good practice. He stood very still and watched her work for a moment before he said anything. He had heard of her. Everyone in Sallow Creek had heard of her. She had appeared sometime in the early summer, nobody could say exactly when, and had taken up in the ruin of the Harrow Mill at the south edge of town, the old stone building that had been empty since the flood of 18 years ago. People left her alone mostly, which was not the same as leaving her in peace. The miller's wife called her a squatter. The cooper's son called her a scavenger. The tanner had once thrown a stone at her from the roadway, not to hit her, he'd said, only to hurry her along, which Emmett had heard about second-hand and which had sat sourly in him since, the way a small dishonesty sits, not sharp but present. He had not thrown any stones. He had also never spoken to her, which he had not thought about until now. He watched her cut 3 more stems of comfrey, tuck them into the basket with the same careful hands, and then move along the fence line toward the cluster of self-seeded yarrow that had taken over the back corner. She moved with the quiet of someone who expected at any moment to be interrupted, and had decided not to let that possibility slow her work. He pushed open the back door and walked out into the garden. She heard him. He saw her go still, the knife hand dropping to her side, her back to him, her whole posture shifting into the particular stillness of someone deciding whether to run. He had seen that stillness before in his practice. He had seen it in people who'd had enough bad surprises that their bodies stopped waiting to find out what this one was going to be. "That's good comfrey," Emmett said. "The white-root kind. Clara, my wife, she planted it 30 years ago. I've never done a thing to earn it, it just keeps coming." The orc woman turned around. Her eyes were amber-dark, careful, and very direct. She was perhaps 40, perhaps older, it was not easy to tell. The braids that framed her face were threaded through with small dried things. A sprig of something he didn't recognize, a loop of dry grass, 2 seeds on a twist of fiber. A healer's habit, he thought, or a naturalist's, labeling by proximity. He had done the same himself for 30 years. She didn't speak. "You're welcome to the yarrow too," he said, "and whatever else has gone to seed at the back. I don't use half of what grows there, and it'll winter over fine either way." He paused. "I'm the apothecary, Emmett Vance." She studied him for another moment. Then, "I know." Her voice was low and steady, and carried no apology in it. "Do you dry what you gather?" he asked. "Yes." "You're welcome to the drying shed." He nodded toward the small stone outbuilding at the side of the house. "I don't use it in the cold season. There's a rack and a cord line, and it stays dry. Better than the mill for that kind of work, I'd expect. She looked at the shed, then at him, and he could see her doing the calculation a person does when they've been let down enough times that kindness requires accounting for before it can be trusted. He understood that calculation. He had seen it in a great many faces across his counter over the years. He didn't take it personally. "No cost," he said, because he thought she needed to hear it plainly. She was quiet another moment. Then she nodded once and turned back to the yarrow. Emmett went inside. He did not watch from the window. He lit the lamp, put the kettle on, and ate his supper at the kitchen table with the evening paper, and he did not spend much time wondering whether she would come back or what the neighbors would say if she did. The yarrow was going to go to waste if nobody cut it, and the shed was sitting empty, and he had never been a man who found complicated reasons not to do the obvious decent thing. In the morning, when he went out to check the comfrey, the drying shed door was latched from the outside. He opened it. The rack along the top was full of sorted bundles, comfrey and yarrow in their own rows, each bundle tied evenly, the knots the same throughout. His own comfrey bundle from the week before, which he'd left in a disordered heap on the lower shelf, had been retied with the same knot. He stood in the doorway of his own shed for a long moment, looking at the orderly rows, and he felt something in the quiet of it that he had not felt in some time. Not surprise, exactly. More like the recognition of something good. He left it exactly as it was and went to open the shop. The cold came in the first week of November, the way it always did in Sallow Creek, not gradually but all at once, as though the mountains had simply decided. The creek froze at the shallows. The road turned to iron underfoot. Emmett laid in his winter stores, set the small stove in the back room burning, and went about his days in the particular rhythm of a frontier apothecary in the cold season: the morning compounds, the afternoon patients, the evening bookwork. He was not unhappy in this rhythm. It was the life he had built, and it fit him, and if it was sometimes quiet in a way that had weight to it, he had long since stopped expecting that to change. She came to the shed most mornings before first light. He knew because he was an early riser himself, and when he went to the back door to check the frost, he could see the thin thread of smoke from the shed's little chimney if she had the brazier going. He never went out to the shed in those early hours. He left her to her work, the way he would have left any craftsperson to theirs. But he began to leave things. He left a jar of oil for the rack joints, which had been sticking in the cold. He left a new length of cord line, coiled, on the shelf below the old fraying one. He left 2 bundles of his own lavender, the good French sort, which he'd ordered in from the city at considerable expense, tied with the same even knot she used. She left things in return. The first time, it was a small bunch of something she'd laid across his lavender. A gray-green sprig, slender-stemmed, smelling faintly of cold earth, and something he couldn't quite name but which struck him, somehow, as medicinal. He pressed a little of it between 2 sheets of paper and took it inside and studied it against every reference he owned. He pulled out the Thornby Index, the Common Pharmakeia, the old Harrowfield Compendium that had been his father's, and a newer survey of mountain botanicals that he'd bought at a conference in the city 7 years ago. He knew his herbs. He had grown up knowing his herbs. He had apprenticed under the best apothecary in Thornwall and then come home and served Sallow Creek for 30 years, and whatever this was, it was in none of his books. He read the Harrowfield entry on cold climate comfrey twice to be sure he wasn't missing it, and he wasn't. This was something else entirely. He set it in a small glass jar on his work table, where he could see it while he worked. The second time she left something, it was a paper. Not a note, no words, but a careful illustration, the kind of press plant drawing you found in the good botanical compendia. Every vein and stipule accounted for, the root cross-section shown separately, the proportion clean. The plant was the same gray-green sprig, drawn from 3 angles. Below the drawing, in a tight and certain hand, were 2 columns of marks, not letters he recognized, but consistent ones, clearly a notation system of some kind, a way of recording properties. He sat with it for an hour and could not decode the notation but could see the structure of it, the logic, the way it accumulated. It was not a casual system. It was the work of someone who had thought very carefully about how to write down what they knew. He set the paper beside the jar. The third time, on a morning when the temperature had dropped so sharply that the shed's little brazier could not have been doing much good, he packed a small tin with oat bread and a wedge of hard cheese and a folded cloth and left it on the workbench before he opened the shop. He did not know for certain that she hadn't eaten. It was possible she had, and this was unnecessary. But the cold was real, and he was an apothecary by long habit, a man who had spent his life noticing when people needed something and providing it without ceremony. When he came back at noon to check on a preparation he'd left in the shed, the tin was on the back step, empty, washed clean, and the folded cloth laid neatly inside. He took it to the kitchen and refilled it. It was the last week of November when she knocked on the back door for the first time. He opened it, and she was standing on the step holding the tin in both hands, and she did not look uncomfortable exactly, but she looked like someone who had made a decision after considerable deliberation and had arrived. "Come in," he said. She came in. She stood in the kitchen and looked around it, the shelves of labeled jars, the work table with its press and its spread papers, the two chairs by the stove that had always been a pair and were only used one at a time now, with the same quiet deliberateness she brought to everything. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table. "Sit down," he said, "unless you'd rather stand." She sat. She wrapped both hands around the cup and drank, and he sat across from her with his own cup, and for a while neither of them spoke. That was fine. Some of the best conversations he had ever had in this kitchen had started with a silence that lasted long enough for both people to arrive in it fully. "The plant you don't know," she said at last. "What did you want to know about it?" He looked at her. "Everything," he said, and he meant it. Something shifted in her expression, very slightly, not for long. But it was there, the flicker of someone who has been carrying something for a long time without being asked about it. "It's cold ground root," she said. "Orc name doesn't translate well. Your books don't have it because it doesn't grow below the mountain line and because your botanical surveys have never reached into the valleys where the Sketh range. It comes up in the first frost, not before, looks like almost nothing above ground, a few gray stems. The root is where the work is. You'd walk right past it." "What does it do?" "Fever work mainly. Not the quick kind, not the kind that breaks in a day or two. The deep, slow kind. The kind that settles in the lungs and won't let go." She drank her coffee. "It slows the progression of the deep cold fever, gives the body time to do its own fighting. There's a mechanism in it, I don't have words for it in your language, but the effect is that the fever can't climb past a certain point while the compound is active. The body gets a ceiling and then it can work." She paused. "You have to know the preparation, though, or it does nothing. The raw root is inactive. You can eat it and feel nothing." "What's the preparation?" "Long," she said. 2 days. The root has to be split and dried a particular way first, not how you dry anything else, not heat-dried, cold air only at a specific rate. Then there's a steep in cold water, a grinding at a particular coarseness, and a final compound with 2 other plants that are common enough you'll have them in a ratio that matters." She set down her cup. "I'll show you if you want." Emmett considered this. The apothecary in him, the part trained to caution, to the tested and the documented, registered all the usual questions. The source, the lineage, the verification. The other part of him, which had been practicing long enough to know that most of what he understood had come from watching someone else do it rather than from a book, said, "Yes, pay attention." "I'd like that," he said. She came back the next morning with a small cloth bundle, the root cleaned and split by some method already done, and she sat up at his worktable and talked while she worked. Not a lecture. It was the way one craftsperson speaks to another when they assume comprehension, and trust the listener to ask when they need to. He had talked that way himself 1,000 times. He had not been talked to that way in years. The preparation was meticulous, and she knew it the way you know something when it has been in your hands and your family's hands for generations. The kind of knowing that is past conscious thought, that lives in muscle and reflex, and a certainty so deep it reads as quietness. She showed him the cold air drying step, which was genuinely unlike anything in his training. The precise arrangement of the split root, the spacing, the way you tested dryness by feel at the inner surface rather than the outer. She showed him the grinding, which required a specific stone, an emotion that was more lateral than vertical. She showed him the temperature of the steeping water, cool enough that he had to hold his hand in it for 10 seconds without discomfort, and the exact color change that told you the steep was complete. She showed him the ratio of the final compound, measuring by eye in a way that he knew was not casualness but deep practice precision. She stayed until early afternoon. When he had questions, she answered them without impatience, and when he made a small error in the grinding motion, she said simply, "More flat, less down," and demonstrated until he had it. When she left, he sat at the work table and wrote down everything she had shown him and said, and when he was done, the notes filled 7 pages. He read them through once to check them. Then he made himself a fresh cup of coffee and sat with the gray-green sprig in its jar, and thought about what a person carries when they carry knowledge for a generation, and how little any bookshelf really knew. December came, and with it the snow. Grail, he had learned her name, which she had given him simply, without ceremony, sometime in the 2nd week of November, offering it as a thing she did not usually give and was giving now because she had decided he had earned it, came to the shed most mornings and to the kitchen most afternoons, and what had begun as cautious proximity had settled into something warmer and more ordinary. She had a lifetime of learning behind her, and it showed in everything. Her people, the Sketh clan, she told him once, not at length but clearly, as a fact she saw no reason to withhold, had kept healers the way other communities kept records, with care and the understanding that this knowledge was the difference between survival and its alternative. For generations, the Sketh healers had served not only their own clan but anyone who came to them, because sickness did not consider clan lines, and neither, her grandmother had taught her, should the healer. Her grandmother had trained her. Her grandmother's grandmother had trained her grandmother before that. The lineage went back further than anyone could trace with confidence, and Grail carried it the way a person carries a long and serious trust. Not lightly, not with pride exactly, but with the steadiness of someone who understands what would be lost if they set it down. She spoke about her grandmother without sentimentality, and with enormous respect, the two of which Emmett thought was the most useful combination a person could feel about a teacher. She had come to Sallow Creek because the Sketh had ranged south this season, following a particular cold ground route that only grew in certain mountain valleys, and she had stayed because she had found it in good quantity and because she did not say this directly, but Emmett understood it from the way she said everything else. She had been moving for a long time, and the moving had its cost. He listened to all of it the way he had learned to listen across 30 years of an apothecary's practice. Fully, without rushing it toward anything, without the need to fill the spaces with his own words. "The town thinks you're a scavenger," he said one evening in December, not as an accusation, only because it seemed to him that things named plainly were easier to hold than things left circling. "I know," she said. "They're wrong." She looked at him, those amber-dark, careful eyes, and for a moment he thought she might say something complicated, something about being accustomed to it, or about how it didn't matter what the town thought, or any of the things a person says when they've been dismissed often enough that a wall has become necessary and has also become invisible. Instead, she said, "Yes." Just that, plainly, without heat, without resignation. Simply yes, they were wrong and she knew it, and she wasn't asking for his sympathy about it, only confirming the fact with the quiet assurance of someone who had always known their own worth, and was not particularly interested in whether anyone else had caught up. He found this, unexpectedly, one of the most dignified things he had heard in some time. He refilled her coffee. They talked about the preparation of willow bark in compound until the lamp needed trimming, disagreeing in the pleasurable way of two people who share a field and have come to it from slightly different schools of thought, each one genuinely interested in whether the other might be right. The town of Sallow Creek was not a cruel place. That was worth saying plainly, because it was true and because the story was not one of villains. Most of the people in it were ordinary frontier people, hardworking, cautious, accustomed to wariness about what they did not know. The wariness about an orc woman living alone in the abandoned mill was not different in kind from the wariness they would have brought to any stranger who settled in without introduction or reference. They didn't know her. She had not introduced herself to anyone, and nobody had thought to introduce themselves to her. And so the space between them had grown across one summer and half an autumn into something that looked, from both sides, like the other's unwillingness. The cooper's son had thrown the stone. The tanner had said the words he'd said. Most people had not done these things. Most people had simply gone around her at the market, crossed to the other side of the road when she came through, let her buy her necessities at Caro's supply counter without comment, because Caro was a pragmatic man who believed that a coin was a coin and wanted no part of anyone else's feelings about who spent it. Emmett had noted all of this. He had not addressed it with speeches, because speeches were not his manner, and because you could not have a speech with a town, only with people, and one person at a time was slow work and also the only work that held. What he had done was mention her, plainly, in the course of ordinary conversation. When the milliner asked how his winter stores were holding, he said he'd had good luck with the comfrey harvest this year, and that the woman helping him dry and sort it had an eye for botanical work he hadn't come across in decades. When the miller asked how he was getting on since Clara, he said well enough, that he'd found good company in someone who took the herbalist's trade as seriously as he did. Not labored, not a campaign. Just the truth, offered plainly the way you offered any truth that was worth the other person knowing. The milliner looked thoughtful. The miller said, "Oh, who's that?" Emmett said, "The woman at the Harrow Mill, have you met her?" The miller said no, not exactly. Emmett said she knew more about cold ground root than anyone he had come across in 30 years. The miller, who had once had a winter lung that had frightened him badly, took note of that and let it sit. The conversations moved on their own after that. He did not push them. By the beginning of December, she had begun showing him a second plant, which she called, in the Sketh tongue, something that sounded to him like a soft percussion. 2 syllables, the second one trailing off, and which he had taken to calling the silverleaf for the way the underside of each small leaf caught the lamplight and threw it back with an almost metallic shimmer. He had never seen it growing in the wild, though she told him it grew in the high rocky soil above the timber line, coming up between stones in places where nothing else tried. Its use was in poultice form, for the deep aches that settled into joints in the cold months, not curing anything. She was precise about that, but easing the grip of the cold in joints and knuckles in a way that his standard willow and ginger preparations did not reach. He knew 2 patients in Sallow Creek who would feel the difference immediately if he could get the preparation right. Getting the preparation right took a week of mornings. The difficulty was in the grind. The silver leaf needed to be reduced to a paste at a specific texture, fine enough that it would bind in the poultice base, but coarse enough that the cellular structure of the leaf was only partially broken. Too fine and the active part lost something in the process. She could not explain the mechanism, only the result, which was that an overground silver leaf poultice did half the work of a correctly ground one. She showed him the texture she was looking for by rubbing a pinch between thumb and forefinger and letting him feel the comparison. This, not that. It was entirely tactile, which was entirely unlike the measurement-based training he'd had, and it took him several mornings before his hands understood what his brain had been told. Grail was patient with him in the way good teachers were patient, not endlessly tolerant of error, but precise about the nature of the error and clear about what would correct it. When his first poultice had the wrong texture, she told him exactly what it was, described the difference in physical and measurable terms rather than vague ones, which he appreciated enormously. His second attempt was better, but the proportion of the binding base was still off. She told him by how much and waited while he adjusted. The third attempt she looked at for a long time, turning the bowl in her hands, and then said, "That will work." He sent the first prepared batch to 2 patients, the blacksmith's wife and old Render, who had been rubbing his knuckles all winter with the expression of a man who has given up, expecting them to feel different. Both came back in a week saying it was the best they'd felt in cold weather in years. He told them what it was and where it came from, plainly, the way he had begun to say things about Grail to the milliner and the miller. The blacksmith's wife, a practical woman who had been letting her hands get stiff every winter for 20 years and had taken it as the price of the season, looked interested. "The woman at the mill knows this." "She knows more about this trade than I do," Emmett said. It was simply true, and he said it without embarrassment, because being 63 and secure in his competence meant that encountering someone with more to teach him was something he could receive as a gift rather than a threat. She learned it from a lineage of healers. 7 generations at least. The blacksmith's wife looked thoughtful, the particular look of useful information being properly filed away. It was the 3rd week of January when the Pestle boy got sick. Everyone in Sallow Creek knew the Pestle family. Dara Pestle ran the post, and her husband Win was the best carpenter in 3 settlements, and their youngest son Hal was 8 years old and one of those children who occupied more space than his size suggested, loud, cheerful, constantly in motion, the sort of child who could be heard approaching from 2 streets away. He had been sick before, the way all children were, and had always come back from it quickly. He was strong. The town assumed his strength without thinking about it, the way you assume the strength of something you'd never seen fail. This was different. It started as a cough toward the end of the 3rd week, and then the cough went deep, not the loose, productive kind, but the tight, reluctant kind that meant the lungs were troubled. Then the fever came. It was the kind of fever that climbed rather than settling, that red high when you put your hand to a child's forehead and higher still the next morning, the kind that by the 3rd day made the child's eyes look somewhere far away, focused on something the adults in the room couldn't see. Dr. Featherly came and looked grave, which he rarely did. He was an old doctor who had practiced in difficult places and had learned to keep his expressions orderly so as not to frighten patients, and when his expression broke that habit, people noticed. He prescribed willow bark and rest and steam and cold compresses and everything a good doctor who had trained 30 years ago would prescribe for a deep lung fever. He checked in morning and evening. The fever did not move. By the 5th day, Dara Pestle came to Emmett's shop. He was honest with her. He said he was not a physician, that his medicines were not substitutes for Featherly's care, and that the deep-setting lung fever, the kind that climbed and refused to break, was the one he worried about most in children. He watched her face hold itself together with the particular will of a mother who had decided that falling apart could wait. He gave her everything in his inventory that spoke to lung fever, the feverfew compound, the eucalyptus steam blend, the willow and ginger draft that sometimes worked on the secondary inflammation. He was thorough and careful, and when she left he stood behind his counter and felt the weight of not being enough settle across his chest. Then he went out to the shed. Grail was there, working at the bench with her back to the door, measuring something in the low lamplight with the focused concentration she brought to precision work. She heard him come in and turned around, and she took one look at his face. "Who?" she said. "The Pestle boy, Hal, 8 years old. 5th day of deep lung fever. Featherly can't break it." He stood in the doorway, his coat still on, the cold ground root. I have enough. I've been drying it right, the cold air method, the whole November stock. It's fully prepared. She was already untying her apron. 2 days of the compound. The first dose needs to go in tonight, the early stage infusion we worked through in December, the one with the lower ratio. Tell me again, I want to be exact. She moved to the back shelf where several cloth-wrapped packets stood in her careful order, and she walked him through the preparation again. Ratios, sequence, temperature, the specific color and consistency to watch for at each stage. He had notes, and he checked them against what she said, and in 2 places she refined what he'd written down, not correcting him but clarifying a threshold he'd recorded loosely. They made the preparation together at his work table, and when it was done she looked it over and made one small adjustment and held it up to the lamp and said, "That's right." "Will it be enough?" he asked. She was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was being precise about something rather than uncertain. It gives the fever a ceiling. Whether the boy is strong enough to use the room, that's his work. She wrapped the preparation in clean cloth and handed it to him. "Go." He went. He sat with Dara Pessel at her kitchen table and explained the preparation the way Grail had taught him to explain things, clearly, assuming the other person's intelligence, filling in only what they needed. Dara listened with the focused attention of a practical woman who had chosen this as the most useful thing she could do in this moment. He told her the dosing time. He told her what to watch for. He told her that this was a preparation he'd been learning this winter from someone whose knowledge he trusted, and that he trusted it genuinely. Dara gave Hal the first dose that night. Emmett was back at the Pessel house before dawn the next day with the second preparation, and Grail was with him. He had not asked her to come. She had been at his back door when he went to leave at first light, already wrapped in her heavy coat, the day 2 preparation under her arm and her healer's satchel over one shoulder. She did not explain herself, and he did not ask her to. Dara Pessel opened the door before he knocked. She had been up all night, he could see it in her, and she looked at the 2 of them standing on her step in the dark morning, the apothecary and the tall orc woman with the dark braids and the satchel. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider and said, "Come in." Grail looked at Hal. She looked the way she looked at all her preparations and patience, completely, without rushing, taking in what was actually there rather than what she expected to find. She made 3 adjustments to the day 2 preparation at the kitchen table, working with a precision that Emmett watched with attention because this was instruction. He understood, even in this moment. She explained each adjustment to him quietly as she made it. She also explained each step to Dara, who was standing 3 feet away, because Dara was the boy's mother and deserved to understand what was being given to her son, and explaining things to people who deserved to understand them was simply what you did. Hal slept most of that day. Emmett checked in twice. In the afternoon, Grail was sitting quietly near the door when he arrived, and Dara was by the bed, and the house was the particular quiet of a place where people are waiting for something and have agreed to let the waiting be what it is. The fever broke late in the afternoon of the second day. It broke cleanly, the way a good preparation worked when it worked, not all at once but in a long, easing movement that you could see in the child's color and in his breathing, and in the way his hands, which had been clenched, opened slowly across the blanket. Dara pressed her forehead to Hal's and stayed there for a long moment, and the sound she made was not quite crying and was not quite laughter, and was everything that relief sounds like when it finally arrives. Grail was gathering her satchel when Dara crossed the room to her. Emmett stood by the window and held his silence, because this was not his moment. Dara Pessel was not a tall woman, and she had to look up to meet Grail's eyes, and she took both of Grail's hands in hers and held them and said, "Thank you." Grail looked at her for a moment. "He is strong," she said quietly. "Most of it was him." "You came," Dara said. "You didn't have to." "He needed it," Grail said. "That was enough reason." She left. Emmett walked out with her into the cold blue of the late afternoon, and they walked back through Sallow Creek toward his shop without speaking, and the silence between them had the quality of something that had been carried and could be set down now, and they let it be that, and neither of them needed to say so. Word moved through a town of 600 people, the way it always did, not like a river but like water through good soil, quietly and completely. By the following morning, everyone in Sallow Creek knew that Hal Pessel had broken his fever, and that it had broken on the second day of a preparation from Vance's shop, and that the Orc woman from the mill had come to the house with Vance and had worked alongside him. By noon, the story had been through the supply counter and the milliners and the tavern and half a dozen back-fence conversations, and it had the quality of information that a community was still working out what to do with, not settled yet, not finished, but turning in a new direction the way a slow wheel turns when the weight finally shifts. The tanner was heard to say that it was probably all down to Vance and nothing to do with the Orc. Nobody agreed with him. Nobody argued with him either, which was a form of disagreement that in Sallow Creek tended to do more work than the spoken kind. There was a quiet around it that was, in its way, a form of reassessment happening at its own deliberate speed. Dara Pessel told the story the way she had lived it. She was not a dramatic woman, and she did not tell it dramatically. She told it the way she told everything, which was accurately and in the order it had happened. The two of them at the door in the dark morning. The work at her kitchen table, explained to her as it was being done. The Orc woman sitting near the door through the long afternoon, quietly available, not intruding but present. The way Hal's hands had opened when the fever broke. She told this story several times in the days after, to whoever asked her, and she told it the same way each time because there was only one way it had happened. The miller's wife, who had called Grail a squatter in the summer, though she had not said so loudly, came to Emmett's shop 4 days after the Pessel boy was up and running again, bought her winter herbs, and asked in passing whether the woman who'd helped with the fever was all right out at the mill in this cold. Emmett said she was managing. The miller's wife said she had been meaning to say she'd heard what happened, and she did not finish the sentence. The M was doing considerable work by itself. She knows more about this trade than most people I've ever trained with, Emmett said, plainly, without decoration, the way he said all his plain truths. She comes from a lineage of healers, 7 generations that she can trace. It's a serious tradition. The miller's wife nodded slowly and took her herbs and left, and Emmett could see on her face the particular expression of a person adjusting a long-held picture to make room for something that had been there all along without being seen. The following week, Caro at the supply counter began putting Grail's purchases through without making her wait for the counter to clear first. It was a small adjustment. It was not nothing. Small adjustments made by 600 ordinary people over the course of enough ordinary days were how a town decided what it was. February brought 3 more cases she helped with, 2 more deep lung fevers, and a badly set broken leg on a young farmhand that had been knitting wrong for 6 weeks and needed to be addressed before it set that way permanently. The bone work was different from the herbalist's practice. She had a knowledge of how bone knit and what it needed that was as deep and precise as her plant knowledge, and she worked on the leg case alongside Featherly, because Featherly, for all that he was old and had been trained by an older school, was a good doctor and secure enough in his own competence that he did not resent encountering competence elsewhere. He asked her afterward where she had trained. She told him. He was quiet for a long time. "The Sketh healing lineage," he said. "Yes. I read about it once," Featherly said, in the tone of a man who had read a great deal and was not often surprised by what he read. "In a physics survey from the Eastern Range. It was an old survey." "My grandmother's grandmother is in that survey," Grail said. "If it's the one I'm thinking of. They interviewed her at a trading post." Featherly looked at her steadily. "Would you be willing to work alongside me for the difficult cases?" He paused, not as an assistant, as a colleague. She looked at Emmett, who was standing near the window, and something passed between them, not a question, only a confirmation, and she looked back at Featherly. "Yes," she said. The tanner's son came to Emmett's shop on the first Thursday of February, with a cough he'd been ignoring for 2 weeks, and that had gotten worse in the cold snap. He was 23, broad across the shoulders, and he came in with the particular stiffness of a young man who is embarrassed about needing something. Emmett recognized the presentation. He had seen it many times. "Sit down," Emmett said. The young man sat at the consultation stool. Emmett listened to his breathing and assessed his color and asked the usual questions, and then prepared a standard Lungy's draft good for the early stage presentation. Nothing that required the cold ground route, nothing serious yet. "Come back in 3 days," he said. "If it's worse by then, I'd want Featherly to see you." The young man was paying when Grail came through from the back. She had been in the still room they'd begun using, working at the bench, carrying a batch of labeled preparations to the front shelf. She moved past without looking at him, set the preparations down, and went back. The young man watched her pass. He looked at the bottle in his hands. "Is she the one who helped the pestle boy?" he said, not quite a question. "Yes," Emmett said. A pause. "I threw a stone at her in the summer." Emmett said nothing. He let the sentence stand, which was what it deserved. "I shouldn't have," the young man said. "No," Emmett said, simple and clean, not a speech. Another pause. Is there a way to?" He stopped. "Come back in 3 days," Emmett said gently. "If you want to speak to her, she'll be here in the afternoons." The young man left. Emmett stood at the counter and thought about the particular shape of change, not dramatic, not all at once, but this way. This slow and ordinary and irreversible way. March arrived with the thaw. In Sallow Creek, the thaw meant mud and swollen creek banks, and the smell of the world remembering what it was before the cold. Emmett laid in his spring orders, aired out the shop, and started thinking about the space at the back, the old consulting room that had been his father's, which had stood empty since Clara died because he'd never had the heart to clear it properly and never had the need. He had need now. He spent a Saturday clearing it. It was good work, the kind that required only your hands and a willingness to make decisions, and at the end of it the room was clean and empty and full of afternoon light, and it smelled of old wood and new air, which was a good smell. He stood in the middle of it and thought about what it would look like with a proper bench along the north wall and the herb press and the small still set up in the corner. He went to find her. She was in the drying shed, checking the spring stock. He could see the shift in the lamplight from the kitchen window that meant she'd moved from the bench to the rack. He made 2 cups of coffee and carried them across the wet April grass and knocked. "Come in." The shed was warm with the brazier and smelled of what it always smelled of now. The sharp sweet of the lavender, the earthier compound of the cold ground root, the green fresh smell of something new she'd brought in that week from the upper lot, which he was looking forward to learning about. The rack was full, the bundles in the order they had worked out together over the winter, half his notation system and half hers, running side by side. She took the coffee. They stood at the bench. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. She waited, which was her usual manner with a statement that came in that shape. The back room of the shop, the old consulting room. He looked at the rack rather than at her, not from awkwardness but because it was easier to think while looking at the work. "I spent Saturday clearing it. It's a good room, good light, dry, the right size for a still set and a bench, and it's a proper room, not a shed." He paused. "What you know belongs in front of people properly, not in here. Not if the town is going to start bringing their serious cases to the front door, which I believe they're going to do." He looked at her. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a partnership. Your knowledge, my license, the same shop, the same patients, a fair arrangement of the income, and your name on the sign." Grail held her coffee and was quiet for a moment. He let her be quiet. "The apartment above the shop," she said. "The 2 rooms." "Yes, small but decent. Good stove, south-facing windows, the same dry walls as the shop. Better than the mill in every practical sense." He paused, and closer to the work. She looked at the shed, the rack, the bundles, the months of careful work that had accumulated here between them, and her expression had the quality of someone doing a final accounting of something before they allow themselves to decide. He had seen that look on her before, and he had learned to wait it out. She did not make decisions carelessly, and the decisions she made held. "The mill is cold," she said at last. It was a simple statement of a simple fact, delivered without complaint or self-pity, and it was also everything he needed to hear. "Then move out of the mill," he said. She nodded once, looking at the rack. Then she picked up her coffee and drank the rest of it, and set the cup down with the small, definitive sound of something settled. That was enough. On the first warm morning of April, Emmett Vance had the new sign hung above the door of the apothecary shop by 8 o'clock. He'd had the carpenter make it from a single clean piece of oak, the letters burned in straight and deep. It was a good sign. He was not, in general, a vain man, but he had taken some trouble with the letters because he thought they earned it. The sign read, "Vance and Gral. Apothecary and Healer. Est, 31 years the Sketh healing tradition." He had asked her whether she wanted the tradition named on the sign. She had been quiet for a moment and then said yes. Yes, because her grandmother had taught her that knowledge was only as permanent as the number of people who knew it existed, and she would not let it stand unnamed when it could be there in plain oak for anyone to read. The morning it went up, Dara Pessel walked by with Hal, who was entirely recovered and running at full volume the way he always had and always would. Dara stopped and looked up at the sign for a long moment, and then she called up to the open second-floor window where Grail was arranging the still room. "Good morning, Grail." And Grail leaned out and said, "Good morning," and Dara waved and walked on, and Hal shouted something about whether there was still some of the fever medicine left because his friend Tobias had a cold, and Grail told him to send Tobias in the afternoon, and she would see what was needed. Old Featherly came by at noon, stood in front of the sign with his hands behind his back, read it twice, and said, "About time." Then he went in and sat with Grail in the consulting room for 2 hours going over the bone-setting case from February in the unhurried, mutual way of two people who respected each other's work and had things to learn from the comparison. Even the miller's wife came. She stood in front of the shop and looked at the sign for a while, and she was quiet, and then she went in and bought a packet of the silver-leaf poultice preparation and said thank you when she left in a way that had some weight to it. The tanner's son came in a week later. He had come back in 3 days, as Emmett had said, and his cough had resolved, and today he came in with an empty bottle and stayed near the door for a moment looking at Grail at the consulting room bench. He said nothing. He left more than he owed on the counter and went. Emmett thought that was about right. Not everything needed to be a speech. Some things just needed to be different than they had been. In the evenings that spring, they had a habit. It was not a grand thing, and it had not been planned as a thing at all. It was simply what happened when two people who have been working alongside each other through a long season find that the end of the working day is the right time to account for what they've learned and what remains open. He would make coffee, always 2 cups, which had become a reflex he no longer thought about, and she would bring something. A plant she'd found that afternoon, a case they'd both been thinking about, a question about a preparation that had behaved unexpectedly in the cold, a piece of Sketh botanical notation that she was trying to render into terms he could work with. And they would sit at the kitchen table in the warm house and talk, and the creek outside ran fast and clear with the snowmelt, and its sound was the sound of everything returning to what it was before winter locked it. He had not had anyone to talk to about the work, truly talk, since Clara. It was not the same thing. He would not have said it was the same thing, and he would not have wanted to suggest it was. But it was a good thing. A warm and real and particular good thing, found exactly where it had been waiting. Here, in his own back garden in the gray light of an October evening, a woman cutting comfrey with a careful knife, the whole winter ahead of them. He had given her the use of a drying shed. She had given him in return the knowledge of 7 generations of healers, a child's life saved, a town slowly turning its face toward someone it had dismissed, a still room full of preparations his books had never imagined, a name on the sign, and a table that was no longer set for one. That was what simple decency sometimes did, when it was offered without condition and met with the same. It kept coming back. Like the white-root comfrey in the corner of the garden, planted once by a good woman 30 years ago, requiring nothing after that, returning faithfully every year to offer itself again to whoever was willing to notice it and use it well. The creek ran through the April night. The lamplight lay warm across the kitchen floor. The coffee was hot. And Emmett Vance, who had eaten alone for 11 years, set out 2 cups as a matter of course. The way you did a thing that had become simply what your evenings looked like now, and heard the door. And Grail came in, unwrapping her coat, and sat down across from him, and they were quiet in the comfortable way of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill the silence. And then she said, "I found something new today in the upper lot. I don't think it'll be in any of your books." And he leaned forward with both hands around his cup, and she began to talk, and he listened, and the spring evening settled around them, warm and full and good.